I'm a middle-aged Russian man who's going to tell you about when I and my grandpa had a dramatic encounter with a Bigfoot about 20 years ago. At that time, my family lived in the countryside of northern Russia. My grandparents also lived very close, and it often happened that I accompanied my grandpa out into the woods to hunt grouse. This event took place during one of these hunting trips when I was 13 years old. It was a Sunday morning in early October, as I was walking along the gravel road to my grandparents' farm, which was a few hundred yards from our house. It rained a little lightly and the air was cold and fresh. Grandpa sat at the window and waved happily when he saw me. When I stepped into the house, I was met by Grandma, who asked me to sit at the kitchen table and drink a cup of coffee. Grandpa reported that he had already had time to drink several cups of coffee. I also noticed that he had drunk a considerable amount of vodka because he smelled of alcohol and was drunk. I sat down at the kitchen table and drank my coffee while Grandpa explained the plans for today's hunt. He told me that we would go up to the mountains where there were always plenty of grouse. A little while later we started our journey. The rain had begun to subside, and the sun had begun to break through the cloud cover. Grandpa walked in front of me, with the shotgun hanging over his shoulder. As usual, I had borrowed my father's shotgun. When we had crossed a shallow stream, we stopped and rested for a few minutes. We had traveled for 30 minutes and had covered a few miles. Grandpa took a few sips of the vodka he was carrying in his jacket pocket. He said he had high hopes for today's hunt. He said he had a very good gut feeling. Unfortunately, it would later turn out that that gut feeling was wrong. It took us another 30 minutes before we had reached our goal. We followed an old path that wound up the mountain. It did not take long before we frightened a flock of grouse that flew up and settled in the trees some distance away. We snuck closer and I had the opportunity to kill my first grouse of the day. Grandpa patted me on the back and said that I was a good hunter and that he was proud of me. He handed me the bottle of vodka and asked me to take a few hearty sips. It is good. Drink properly so you get as much pubic hair as Grandma, said Grandpa and laughed. It was then that we suddenly heard the sound of a tree branch breaking off in the dense forest in front of us. Grandpa raised his shotgun and said it was probably a moose or a bear. He said I should not worry, that both bear and moose are more afraid of us than we are of them. We then continued our journey slowly along the mountain path. Despite Grandpa's soothing words, a sense of dread began to creep in. I also realized that the forest suddenly seemed dead. It was completely quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and all that could be heard was the faint whistling of the wind in the trees. Suddenly everything felt unreal. I think Grandpa felt the same way, because he periodically looked over his shoulder with concern in his eyes. Suddenly the silence was broken by commotion in the dense forest in front of us. It sounded like a locomotive was crashing through the woods in our direction. I panicked and started running back along the path, but I stopped when I looked over my shoulder and Grandpa was still standing. I still do not know to this day why he did it, but I suspect he was paralyzed by fear. Seconds later, it crashes out between the trees and stands 15 meters in front of my grandpa. At first it just stands there and looks at my grandpa, who is shaking with fear. At this point, I am also paralyzed by fear. The creature is huge. It is at least 9 feet high and extremely muscular. He's like the biggest Vladimir Putin you can imagine. I realized that what is on the path in front of us is a Bigfoot. I knew the concept because since childhood I had heard stories about these creatures in the Russian forests. Suddenly, the creature roars and runs an attack on my grandpa, who does not have time to react. Despite its enormous size, it moves unnaturally fast. Before I know what's going on, the creature grabs Grandpa's crotch and lifts him high in the air. Grandpa screams in panic and drops the shotgun on the ground. I hear the sound of Grandpa's screams and the sound of something being crushed when the creature squeezes its huge hand. The last thing I see before I faint is how the creature throws my grandpa into the trees. I do not know how long I fainted, but I woke up to someone holding my shoulders and shaking me. It was my grandpa. He hissed in my face that we must hurry home, and that I must help him. He said that his balls were totally destroyed, and that he could not walk. When I thought of Grandpa's big, broken balls, I almost fainted again. The journey home took several hours, even though we both tried to force the distance as fast as possible. Grandpa hung around my shoulders and it felt like I was carrying him at times. Sometimes we took short breaks so that Grandpa could take a sip of vodka. Grandma came out on the porch when she saw us approaching the house. She called to us and asked what had happened. Grandpa hissed that he had broken balls and an injured foot. Grandma, who at this time of day was already quite drunk, began to laugh. I helped my groaning grandpa into the house while Grandma laughed and watched. I led Grandpa into the bedroom and laid him on the bed. Grandma, saying she would check the damage, went into the bedroom and closed the door behind her. I sat on a stool outside and heard my grandpa's moaning mixed with Grandma's laughter. I heard her say he was no longer a man. As you have probably already guessed, Grandpa survived his injuries. But he changed a lot and never became the same person again. He became a bit of a loner who began to lock himself in his small study and read poetry. Nor did he hunt a single day for the rest of his life. Today, my grandparents are long dead, and I live in Moscow myself. After this event, I also lost all interest in the wilderness. You could say that I choose big city life over end up like my grandpa, frightened for life, mocked by the locals, and broken balls. Thank you for listening to my story, which is completely true.